everybody. On today's episode, we're talking NBA draft. We got two guests here. Do a little housekeeping first. We're going to introduce our new lead NBA draft analyst here for the podcast, Steve Celadon, making his inaugural appearance here on the podcast.
Right. Thank you for having me.
Yep, Steve. And then our guest here this evening, he is the founder of rookiescale.com, a site devoted to NBA draft research, scouting, and intel. Jon Chepkevich. Jon, thank you for joining us here tonight.
Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Good. So why don't you tell everybody about the website and what you're doing there?
Yeah, sure. So I think the origin story, the best way to describe it is that I started helping out with a secondary draft combine a few years ago at the advent of two-way contracts. So there were just more guys, more roster spots in the NBA. And at that time, there was no G League Elite Camp or anything. So there were only, 60-ish guys getting invited to the combine. So we decided to try to invite that next group that could kind of vie for those spots. So we had guys like Jayshawn Tate and Kendrick Nunn and Desmond Bane coming to our event. And so that was pretty successful. But once COVID hit, I had to find a new way to kind of take advantage of what I was doing in the space already. And so started doing some film breakdowns with players, getting some content out there, doing a little bit of consulting with agencies on the side. And it eventually just made sense to kind of roll everything up under one umbrella and kind of launch my own venture. And that's where Rookie Scale was born.
Perfect. And the website for everyone is rookiescale.com. And you can follow Jon on Twitter as well at Jon Chep. That's JONCHEP. So, of course, Jon, NBA draft this week. So very excited about that. So we're going to chop it up here about the draft. So now what's like your favorite, draft memory before we get into anything like that? Where do you kind of get your memories for the draft?
I would say for me, on a more personal note, it was seeing Desmond Bane get picked in the first round because, like I said, we had invited him to our event when he was testing the waters his junior year. And that was before he really blew up and everything. And he's a guy that, we were really vying for, and we're obviously excited to see him, play so well as a senior and boost his stock and everything. So, that's a guy on a more personal level that once he got picked in the first round, I was just really happy for him, really pumped to see that.
Nice. So now getting into this year's draft, guys, who are some of your favorite players that you like in this draft? Jon, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I'll kind of avoid the top of the draft, like the first three guys. Jabari is my guy out of that group, I would say. But my favorite player is probably Baylor's Jeremy Sohan. This is just a guy who I know it gets thrown around a lot, the idea of being switchable 1 through 5, but this guy truly can do it. He's mobile enough, and we've seen it in action, guarding legitimate point guards and guarding big men. So that defensive versatility is just through the roof. He has legitimate size. I saw him up close in person at his pro day here in Chicago during Combine Week. And I think there's enough skill offensively to be excited about. Can pass a little bit, bring some stuff to the table there. It's just a matter of if the shot can come around. But that's a guy that I'm really high on and I really like.
Now, I know, Steve, you had him in your top 10. You'd like him maybe going to New Orleans.
Yeah.
Sochan, another player you like as well as who else do you think you like in this draft?
Well, similar to what he just said about Sohan, the versatility is wild. At 6'9", he even guarded, I think it was, what was the guy, the center from UNC, Bocat, pretty admirably when they got eliminated in the tournament. So sticking with the versatility player, I like Dyson Daniels. I think that his stock went up immensely during the combine. Just being a 6'8" point guard that could defend on multiple positions, that could distribute the ball. I think that he's got the ability to learn how to shoot the three effectively in the NBA. I actually think the NBA pace will fit him more than what a college or a G League does for him. So I'm really excited about him, just like Sohan.
Yeah, now you like him maybe going 6 to Indiana. How high do you think a guy like Dyson Daniels can go, Jon?
He could definitely crack his way into, he's in that tier right after the top three guys. So it's really a matter of team preference there. I think ultimately he probably ends up settling in the 7 or 8-ish range, but I wouldn't be surprised if he got into the 5 and 6 conversation there.
All right, well, let's get into that kind of the elite tier now. Talk about Jabari, Paolo, and Chet, of course, the top 3 names that have been talked about pretty much all year. So John, you led off that Jabari is your guy. What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses to his game? And do you think he's going to go number one?
Well, the betting line says that he's the favorite to go number one right now, but it's been kind of interesting seeing some of that change over the past few days. It used to be, Jabari the favorite, Chet kind of in the mix, hanging behind, and Paolo like way, way behind there. But the last few days that has changed a lot. And now Paolo is actually second. There's been a major shift there. So it seems like he might be in contention, but I would guess that Jabari goes first. And, my thought process on Jabari is let's not overthink this, right? Like, this is a guy who's 6'10" and is an elite shooter, like a potentially generational shooter at that size. It's pretty ridiculous how well his shot profiles to the next level. And he's already a great defender, right? Like maybe not the full 1 through 5 extent of Jeremy Sohan, but he has a little bit of that, right? He can really guard multiple positions. He moves really well laterally on the perimeter, containing guys. And he can kind of, either sliding over from the 4 and the help side, protect the rim, maybe play some small ball 5 down the line and unlock some cool lineups for contenders when his team gets there one day. So I don't know. For me, it just really scales up really seamlessly. He'll be able to contribute immediately. And eventually when he's on a contender, he'll add a ton of value. Yeah.
Now you were talking about the odds there, because I think earlier this week, Paolo was plus 1,400 to be the top pick. And I think now you said he's scoot up. I think he's plus like 200 or 400, something like that. He's right there.
Yeah. I think it's 2 something right now. Yeah.
Now looking at Paolo, what do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of his game?
I mean, with Paolo, he might be able to jump in and, just be a legitimate NBA scorer off the bat, right? Like, he's a pretty polished offensive player. The shot, I think, is pretty good, even if the numbers weren't amazing. Like, I think he's going to be able to shoot the ball. So I think, the idea of him jumping in on one of these pretty bad teams and kind of taking the reins as the number one scorer right off the bat it seems like it's going to happen no matter where he lands. And I think his passing is really good for somebody that's 6'10". Like, he's not just a guy who puts his head down and gets to the rim, but he, has great vision at that size. So I think all of that kind of translates pretty cleanly. I think the question might be, what archetype is he on a winning team when it's all said and done? Like, can he be the number one guy on a winning team? Is he good enough defensively to kind of fill that role? Because he doesn't really protect the rim as much, right? So, is he one of these scalable players to championship success, or is he more in the mold of like some of the comps that you hear thrown out there are like a Carmelo Anthony, a Blake Griffin, like in that wheelhouse, which are very good players, don't get me wrong, but it's just, I think that's the question that people have.
Yeah, I think, Steve, when we spoke earlier today, we were talking a little bit about Paolo, and I think one of the things you were telling me about is his touches and how his efficiency, even though on limited touches this year with Duke.
Yeah, like John just said, I think that if you're looking for someone to join your team and have an immediate impact, I think that Paolo's the most ready to contribute day one, at least offensively. The reason that I don't like Paolo's fit as a number one pick with the Magic is the Magic just have so much work they need to do to clean up the Jonathan Isaac, the Mo Bamba situation that they're faced with. They seem to be committed with Wendell Carter Jr. I feel like the reason that Jabari is such a perfect fit for the Magic is because he has time to grow with the Cole Anthonys and the Wendell Carters. You kind of have a point, a middle piece, and an end with them. I could see the Magic regretting not taking Chet because I think he's a generational type player. But fit wise, I think Jabari is like a clear option for them.
Yeah. And they, the Magic have really struggled shooting the ball, and Jabari immediately addresses some of that. Right. So, I agree with you that fits really clean, but to what you were saying there, Chet Holmgren kind of more cleanly fits the bill of guys that the Magic have historically liked with his, outlier length and just kind of uniqueness. So they kind of have historically trended toward picking those types of players. So it's definitely an interesting situation that they're in with this number one pick.
Yeah, I know Steve and I mentioned we're talking about Mo Bamba and Jonathan Isaacs and seeing if they're kind of stay with that trend or try to shift away from it a little bit. And then let's get on that third name now. Of course, Chet Holmgren out of Gonzaga. What are your thoughts on him, John?
I mean, I think Chet is awesome. These guys are all really good prospects. It's kind of a, choose your flavor type of situation. But, just because I said I like Jabari doesn't mean I don't like Chet. Like, he's a very good prospect. One thing to keep in mind is he is a whole year older than Jabari, which, sometimes gets lost in these conversations, but is really meaningful for, guys at this point in their careers. A whole year of development is something to consider. But everyone brings up the frame, everyone brings up that he's skinny, whatever. Like, I don't think that's as big of a problem as people kind of make it out to be. I think, guys tend to fill out in their early 20s, whether they're professional athletes or just, one of us three, right? Like, that just is life. And I think that's going to be the situation for him when he gets in an NBA strength and conditioning program. Like, he'll be able to add some weight. Like, Anthony Davis was skinny coming out, not this skinny, but people forget how skinny he was, and he's put on weight. And so I think he'll kind of figure that out, but you just hope that, the long, gawky, awkward frame guys like that are typically a little bit more prone to foot injuries, lower body injuries. So you hope that doesn't end up being the case for him. But so far it hasn't been. So all in all, think he's immediately an amazing defensive player, can add value there off the bat, great transition, trailing 3-point shooter, great finisher at the rim. So there's definitely a ton to like.
Yeah. Now, how do you think it's going to shake out with these guys 1 through 3?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of smoke going around right now, but if I were to guess, I still kind of think it's going to end up falling the way people have thought for a couple months now, with Jabari 1, Chet 2, and Paolo 3. But, nothing would surprise me here. The Magic have, seemingly been trying to play it pretty close to the vest, and Oklahoma City always does. Like, people never know what they're going to do. Like, they're really sharp, really buttoned up. They don't let anything leak. So, I wouldn't be surprised for them to go a different direction too, but that's going to still kind of remain my guess for the time being, unless we hear something else in the next 36 hours to 48 hours.
Yeah. And then one point that Steve brought up as well was the thought of next year's draft and having a guy like Victor Wembanyama available. Mm-hmm. And, OKC might be looking at him and Chet play similar roles. So would they maybe pass on a guy like Chet for Paolo, looking at the future for next year as well?
Yeah, they're in an interesting situation with all the picks that they have and the current makeup of their roster. I think their whole strategy is to maintain flexibility, right? And acquire asset value and maintain flexibility. So I don't know that they would necessarily be scared off from taking the best player, in their opinion, at even looking forward to something like that. I think they would be happy to have both of those guys, and then you can kind of just figure it out from there. Like, maybe they can play together, and if they can't, then they'll be able to trade one of them elsewhere and bring someone else in, right? Like, they just have so much maneuverability that I think they'll go with who they truly think is best.
Yeah, either that or they'll find themselves in a place like my Celtics are, where they would decide whether Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown can play together, and then during the offseason they talk about trading one of them.
Yeah, well, now those types of conversations seem a little bit sillier at this point in time, given the run that they made. So sometimes you got to take some time to see these things through, and I think the Thunder are very, very patient with this kind of stuff. So that's what I would imagine they would do.
Yeah, I know Sam Presti definitely is kind of slow build there, a lot of draft picks, so it's going to be a young development thing with them for sure. So I think the big name from the draft, I feel like the last couple of weeks, has been Jaden Ivey. He's now crept his way up to number 4. What do you like about Jaden Ivey, and do you think he's going to go in that 4 slot?
So I've seen Jaden Ivey in person a couple of times this year, against Iowa and against Florida State. And I mean, the explosiveness is just off the charts, right? He's like a big outlier in this draft class as far as that explosiveness getting to the rim. He's an insane athlete, has unreal burst. And, that's what makes him special, right? I think that as far as if he actually goes number 4 or not, definitely hinges on the Sacramento Kings and sort of who they value and if they might end up trading that pick. There's been a decent amount of buzz and talk about that. People have been saying that they have, pretty strong interest in Keegan Murray, who, again, I've seen in person and is a hell of a player. I saw him work out here in Chicago with his agency's pre-draft work, and he's a great player as well. So some people tend to think that the Kings might trade back a couple picks, and somebody who really wants Ivy might trade up to 4 and make that happen. People have alluded to the Indiana Pacers as a potential trade partner there, and those two teams are familiar with each other from making that Sabonis and Tyrese Halliburton trade last year. So there's a lot of stuff in play there, but all in all, my guess would be Ivy goes 4 one way or another.
Yeah, now, Steve, I know you like Jaden Ivey, and you see a lot of action at that 4-5 slot, even possibly seeing Ivy sneak into maybe that top 3. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just don't think the Kings, call it what you will, are man enough to draft Ivy. I don't think the Kings are ready to take on another guard that could possibly be a lead guard and then have to pull the escape cord on it like they did. Like, I like drafting for fit and not talent. And I think the Kings drafting fit is more of a Keegan Murray than the talent is Ivy. We just saw it when they drafted Tyrese Halliburton. And most of the people that I talked to said that he should have been the guard of the future, not Fox, but yet they pulled the ripcord and got out of that situation. I don't see them taking Ivy outright at 4. I do think that they would be more inclined to trade back in the draft, and not even that far. I think that just going back a slot with the Pistons taking the 4, allowing them to get someone dynamic like Ivy to put alongside a shooting lead point like Cade would be a big win for them. And that way the Kings could say, hey, we safely took the best player available at 5, who was Keegan Murray. And no one could really blame them for that at that point. But yeah, I think Ivy's electric. As a biased Knicks fan, I keep hearing rumors about them trying to make a move. I don't see it happening. Ivy could whisper the Knicks in every interview that he wants. I still don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, that'd be a huge move for the Knicks if they went up to get Jaden Ivey. That'd be a big news. I know you'd be a happy man for sure on your rooftop there.
I would be a happy man. Just the Kings don't need anything that we have. I don't think that Sabonis and Randall even like each other, and that's the person that we're trying to show the door. So yeah, I think it's a lost cause for us. I think we're sticking at 11.
Yeah, I like the idea that you laid out there with the 4 to 5 swap as far as the where the picks would land and the fits accordingly, though. I do like the idea of Ivy playing alongside Cade. And right now that Detroit roster isn't particularly explosive. Like, they have a lot of nice players in place, but not any kind of freakish athletes like that. And I think he would kind of complement their current roster pretty well. And then similar to what you were saying on Keegan in Sacramento, I think that fit is pretty clean. And, based on previous moves that they've made, that it seems that they've made it fairly evident that they plan to contend for a playoff spot right now. Like, they're trying to win. And Keegan's a guy who's probably, ready to get in there and add value to a team that's trying to win games. Like, he's that kind of guy. So I think that, if a little swap were to happen like that, or those players were to somehow end up on each of those teams, it would be a nice fit each way.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of see definitely some action there. I feel like in those spots it'll be an interesting night there Thursday. Now, John, who are some of the guys that you feel like have been the biggest risers during the draft process, and maybe some guys whose stocks have fallen during the process?
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple that, specifically during the pre-draft process, not necessarily the season long kind of steady risers, but the more sharp ones the past, couple months here, I would say, are Jalen Williams out of Santa Clara, who now has a real chance of going in the late lottery, which is pretty wild. I mean, he was one of the big winners of the NBA Combine. He measured extremely, extremely well. I think people were kind of taken aback when they saw the numbers actually come through, because this guy ended up being, 6'4.5" barefoot with a 7'2" and a quarter wingspan. Like, that differential is ridiculous. And then he posted some of the best athletic testing numbers, vertical wise and whatnot. And then also just went out and crushed in the scrimmage games, which a lot of guys opted not to play in, but he just helped himself on every front there and has been rising throughout the pre-draft process. Probably went from a guy I thought of as being in the, 30s to, early second round to 40 range to now potentially lottery. So that's one. And then the other I will say is Dalen Terry out of Arizona, who a lot of people thought might be, a guy kind of lining things up for next year's draft that could kind of pop next year at Arizona, make himself a first round pick. And now, I mean, he similarly is basically, I would say I'd be surprised if he wasn't a first round pick now, and he could slide up into the, mid to late teens as well.
Yeah, no, I like that. I was very surprised to see Dylan Terry come out because I'm a U of A guy. I went there for a year. I followed the Wildcats. So I thought next year was going to be his year. He tried to kind of assert himself this year for the Wildcats and try to make that step. So definitely interesting to see. And then is there anybody who you thought has gone down in the process?
The guys who have been sort of sliding a little bit in my database that tracks a lot of this stuff. We've seen Kendall Brown's name kind of start dipping a little bit. And he's a guy who early on in the season, he was as being a top, 7 or so recruit and being this, 6'8" guy with freakish athleticism and, some passing flashes and IQ. He started working his way up into the, kind of mid to late lottery conversation early in the year. And that has since sort of tailed off. And now, most mock drafts have him in the early second round at this point. And I think some of that is due to his lack of confidence and assertiveness as an offensive scoring threat and kind of lack of willingness to shoot. And there's, some questions around all that, but he could, if he does slide that far, I think he's a guy who could very well end up outplaying his draft stock. And it might end up looking silly that he did slide that far. Then the other names, I guess, that I'll throw out there are, Jean Montero, who played with the overtime elite this year. JD Davison, who, was thought of as maybe a mid first round guy early on in the year. And, when people kind of caught up on his tape, he, just wasn't as good as people maybe thought he might be. And then Patrick Baldwin Jr. is an interesting one. I'm not sure totally if he really will slide because he measured really well as well. Like he has legitimate center size and can shoot the ball, but it's just a really funky year for him, was dealing with stuff off the court, getting COVID, some family stuff, had some injuries, just a tough season at Milwaukee and, ended up having some pretty poor athletic testing numbers at the combine. So he's a guy who I feel like has a pretty wide draft range based on all of that.
All right. And then I'm going to get into,
if I could cut quick, Chris, I don't know if you guys would agree, but the person that, and it might be a little more of a prolific name that I've seen drop in every mock draft has been Ty Washington from Kentucky. Mm-hmm. There was a point in the college season where people would tell me like, hey, Steve, if the Knicks still need a point guard of their future, like keep an eye on him. And then after like a horrible NCAA run, I haven't heard his name come up at all, even falling to like the late 20s now at this point.
Yeah, he's a name I see toward the end of the first round right now.
Yeah, I think I can speak to him a little bit. So I saw him play in person when he was still in high school at Arizona Compass Prep, and it was when he was still committed to Creighton at the time. He ended up decommitting like a few days after I saw him play. But when I saw him there, he was playing against Amani Bates's team. They kicked the crap out of Amani Bates' team. Ty, even when he wasn't scoring that much, he was the most dominant player on the floor because he's a pretty just savvy player that controlled the pace of the game. So I get the appeal with him and the idea of him, but again, the age thing comes into play, right? Ty is going to be, he's more than 20 and a half years old at this point, right? That's an old freshman. Like if you think about, Wendell Moore is not that much different in age than him, and he's a junior at Duke, right? So that's part of the equation. And then just, I don't know, there's definitely fair questions about his game. Like some people will point to the injury that he suffered, and then the stats started tailing off after that a little bit. But he's a guy that I understand the idea of, but I'm not like surprised to see him kind of falling more toward the late first round when it's all said and done.
Now, what about a guy like Ochai Agbaji? I feel like he was a guy who's been in a lottery name around there. And then I looked at some analytics that ESPN put out, and they're looking based on analytics, he's more like a second round name. What do you think of a guy like him?
Yeah, some of that comes to the, similar to what I was just talking about with any of these analytical models, age is always like a huge weighted aspect of it. So he's 22. He's not like old for his class, right? For being a senior, he's about, normal age, maybe even youngish. But that's part of the equation. And some of these, so you said it was Pelton's model, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So Kevin Pelton's model, from what I understand, it puts a little bit more weight into certain factors that happen earlier in your career to kind of right size, like comparing seniors versus freshmen and things like that. So sometimes if
stuff in there too, like
yeah, that gets worked into. So Ochai was a little bit of a later bloomer and obviously became one of the better players in college basketball. But I think that might be part of why he gets weighed down a little bit in the models. And seeing him shoot so well this year is obviously nice, but the model might be trying to account for, maybe how stable is that shooting performance? Is that a little bit of an outlier, him being over 40% this year, when prior to that it was, 30, 33, 37, he's been trending up. So maybe it does stabilize like in the high 30s or something, but above 40 still seems, kind of unlikely.
Yeah. Now let's go back to a couple of my U of A guys. What are your thoughts on Ben Mathurin and Christian Koloko?
Steve, you want to hop in on those guys first? You got some thoughts on them?
Actually, it's funny. The most unfamiliar player that I hear could tickle the lottery is Ben Mathurin. I actually get him confused with the Arizona guy. I'm drawing a blank here. Ohio State and the Arizona guy.
Malachi Branham.
Yeah, Malachi Branham. So sometimes I'll be looking up his stats thinking it's the other guy. I really am unfamiliar with those two guys in the draft, unfortunately.
All right, well, I'll jump in. So Mathurin is the guy that the past few days I feel like has gotten a little bit of a jolt in his stock. Like he's been thought of as a top 10 guy this whole time, but I thought he'd more so be in the 8, kind of 8 range. It seems like he might creep up into the 5-6 territory here. He's a guy I remember last year really liking as a freshman. His usage wasn't as, through the roof as it is this year. His role wasn't as prominent, but you saw the flashes, like really athletic, can shoot the ball. I thought there was a chance he would maybe enter the draft last year and didn't, but, was one of the real breakout sophomores this season. And I think the appeal with him is pretty straightforward. He's kind of like a, legitimate NBA athlete, has enough size for, probably a 2 guard, right? And can play some defense, but, isn't all that creative off the bounce and, kind of doing anything in between, right? Like he's athletic, can shoot. And then what else is there? So maybe some teams think that there is some room to grow with that type of stuff. So I think that's the idea of him. And then Koloko has sort of been in this mix with the non top tier bigs. So with, your Walker Kesslers of the world and, I think Mark Williams has kind of ascended up into the top group, but yeah, I would say like Walker Kessler is in that same sort of camp as him, as these like late first, early second round big men. And Koloko was a big breakout guy this year. I mean, he, when he was at Sierra Canyon, he was still pretty raw and just didn't have it totally together yet. But this year, he just seemed so much more confident throughout the course of the season, was one of the better rim protectors in America, and really just like stepped into a full-time starting role and just excelled in every way that you could hope for him to. And, he's not a guy who's likely to stretch the floor. I think he said in some pre-draft interviews that he can do that. And it's not impossible that he's been working on that, but I think the idea is more straightforward in that he's a rim protector first and foremost, and then can also, finish at the rim offensively as like a lob threat as well. So I see him as a guy who probably ends up being in the early second round would be my guess, but could sneak into the end of the first.
All right. Yeah, no, I think he had a huge tournament. That game against TCU just was unbelievable for him. He just dominated that game. It was such a fun game to watch. So I'm excited to watch him in the NBA for sure. Now, John, what are some international players that, people can keep an eye on here in the first round, maybe even the lottery?
So this is, all in all, a fairly down year from an international draft prospect perspective. But I think it's important to consider that part of the reason why that's the case is that, guys like Dyson Daniels is not considered an international prospect this year because he's with the G League Ignite, right? Like there's guys playing in different leagues that have international roots, like Shaden Sharp's from Canada, Matherin's from Canada. You have, John Montero that I spoke of earlier is playing in overtime. He's from the Dominican Republic, right? But among the guys who actually did play international basketball this year, probably the most high profile at this point, you've got Ousmane Dieng, who played with the New Zealand Breakers, that's the same team that like RJ Hampton played for, part of the NBL Next Stars program down there. And to be frank, he was really bad at the beginning of the season. Like he had a tough go. I think it took him time to adjust just on a personal level, like being a young kid from France, going to a new country in Australia. Took some time to adjust to the game because Australia is a pretty physical league, but it was really impressive to see the extent with which he grew and improved over the course of the season. And he was actually very good down the stretch. He's, pushing 6'10", but has real guard skills, can shoot it, can really pass it at that size, and can move really well defensively. So that's probably the cream of the crop as far as a guy with upside up toward the lottery. But after that, it definitely does thin out a little bit.
Gotcha. Now, so we covered this year, pretty in depth. What are some names to look for next year's class? I know we already talked about Wembanyama, but what are some other names we can keep an eye out for this year in college or even the G League?
Yeah, so Wembanyama is just an absolute freak. Like he's one of the best prospects that we've had. And people will say this all the time, but he's one of the best prospects since LeBron. Like he's kind of in that category with your Zions and Lucas and Anthony Davises, like those type of guys. Like, but it's rarefied air, and he certainly deserves that type of praise. But as far as other guys for next year, Scoot Henderson, will be in the mix for one of the top picks. He plays for the G League Ignite. He signed with them as a 17-year-old and actually played with them alongside, Dyson Daniels and Jaden Hardy and those guys this year, but he's not draft eligible yet. So he'll definitely be in the mix for a top 5-ish pick next year. Got to watch. A couple of returners that I like that I think are worth pointing out. One guard that I really like is Houston's Marcus Sasser. I got to see him work out here in Chicago during the pre-draft process while he was testing the waters this year. And this dude's just a gamer. Like he got hurt 12 games into the season this year, was hurt his foot, so didn't get to finish out the season, but he was able to recover in time for the G League Elite Camp this year and just went out there and tore it up. And this is a dude who was putting up about, I think, 8 threes per game early on in the season and converting them at like a 44% clip, can really shoot it, but isn't just a shooter. Like he's a dog on defense. He's got really long arms for his size. He's just a guy that I really believe in and has a chance to be an NBA point guard. So that's one guy I'll be keeping tabs on for sure next year.
Cool. All right, guys. So now, John, I just saw a couple names I saw on the, draft cards and lists of prospects and all that. You got, guys that make me feel old, and Scottie Pippen Jr. and Ron Harper Jr. So are those guys alone on name you think earn second round picks?
Well, I would say, the name doesn't hurt, but I don't think it's enough to, boost their stock in much regard, right? Like, it's an interesting, fun story seeing 2 former Chicago Bull champions, sons, both juniors in the same draft class and everything. But, those guys both do have, legitimate viable chances of being picked in the second round. With Harper, he's a guy who, the question for him has always been the body, but in the opposite way of Chet. Like he carries a little bit of extra weight, has a little like thickness to him, and it's just been a matter of, can he get that under control? And when I saw him at his pro day here in Chicago, he looked a little bit better, a little bit more fit, but there's still a ways to go there. But he is a guy who's a pretty nice player that has good size, can shoot a little bit, and is a smart player. So right now in my consensus rankings, he's 63rd. So just on the outside looking in of being drafted. Scottie Pippen's a guy who's, he was at the G League Elite Camp last year. And then I think his was a little bit better this year as well. He's, 6'1" and change. So, not the biggest guard. And sometimes it's hard, when you're that size, if you're not like a freakish athlete or dog of a defender or something as a point guard, like there's a lot of point guards, backup point guard types. So it's tough to justify sometimes picking those guys. To me, he seems like a guy that goes undrafted, but, ends up on a 2-way contract or something would be my guess.
And Steve, are there any maybe late first rounders, second round guys that you like?
Shooting up, I've been obsessed with Tari Eason. I like disruptors. I like guys that are raw and have room to grow into being an NBA player. His hands are massive. His motor doesn't stop. And I've actually seen him like even get up to like the Atlanta Hawks pick even. Just someone that you could toss on a 2-way contract or put in the G League and just learn how to be a basketball player. I think at LSU, he got by on his pure athleticism and motor. And I think that he could learn to become an NBA player, a viable option. But right now, that's the guy that I like just as a wild card even.
Yeah, to me, he's a pretty interesting one that right now he's up to 15th in my consensus ranking. So he's kind of, sitting there in the mid first. But yeah, most mock drafts, I think, have him in the, 17 to 24 type range. So I'd expect him to be like a late first round pick. And, I guess he probably could use some time in the G League, like to hone some of that in a little bit, but from a physicality perspective, he has a real NBA body and like you were saying, has those huge hands. I think he could be pretty disruptive. I agree with you, Steve, from the get-go.
Now, just kind of a personal question for me, John, as a Celtics fan, we've hit on a little bit. Their only pick in this draft is going to be number 53. So late in the draft, who knows if they even make the pick? I'm guessing it's going to be some international guy that they stash. Who do you think are some names we might hear late and around that 53?
That was kind of my thought too. I could see them stashing someone with that pick. There's a decent amount of guys that are in that mix to get stashed in the 50s. But if they were to go with a domestic player, they have maybe four or so roster spots that guys are either, non-guaranteed or there's some sort of option like that they could swap them out with a draft pick if they felt strongly enough about them. I could see them taking someone who's kind of more ready to contribute, maybe a senior. So I had two names that come to mind for me are Jared Rhoden out of Seton Hall or Tyrese Martin out of UConn. These are both guys that were at the Portsmouth Invitational Tournament in April that I got to see, and Jared Rhoden I saw earlier in the year as well. And, both guys are pretty strong-bodied wings that, have kind of mature games. And Tyrese Martin's a good rebounder for his position, really tough, really physical. Jared Rhoden has some length, and he's also tough. He didn't shoot it as well as you'd like this year, but I think the shot is pretty good, and that'll kind of come around, and he's able to adjust when he's not knocking down his shots by getting to the rim. So if they don't go stash, those would be the two that I think could be in the mix. But if they do go stash, he might be gone, but Gabriel Procida, Italian prospect who's shade under 6'9", I believe, in shoes. No, shade under 6'8" in shoes. Sorry. But he's a very good athlete, good shooter. He's an interesting name to watch as a stash. And then there's going to be I've heard there are going to be a lot of stashes potentially in the second round. So it's kind of, whatever their preference ends up being, if they go that route, there's a variety of choices there.
Yeah, I think it was Fran Fraschilla doing all the international guys. I'm not sure who it is now for ESPN. I know they got a new guy doing that. So we'll have a busy second round, I'm sure. John, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast, breaking down everything NFL or NBA. I keep saying NFL. I don't know. Breaking down everything NBA draft for Thursday night's draft. Steve joining us as well. So, John, why don't you tell the folks where they can check out all your stuff there at Rookie Scale and all your social media platforms?
I'd be happy to do that, but you keep bringing up the NFL draft, and it's just giving me nightmares because I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and
we can get into that another time.
they took Kenny Pickett, and I wasn't super pumped about that. But
okay.
Anyways, Rookie Scale. You can go to rookiescale.com, of course. The social media handle on both Twitter and Instagram is @Rookie Scale. Pretty straightforward. And then for me, my handle is @Jon Chep. It's JONCHEP. So would love for anybody to follow along there and just see the work that I'm doing with all things draft, do some film room breakdowns with prospects, have a consensus weighted big board, have all kinds of stuff going on up there. So be sure to check it out.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone check out all of Jon's stuff and his team there at Rookie Scale, there for the draft and everything afterwards. Steve, our new lead NBA draft analyst, he'll have some content up for you guys on the draft, post-draft.
Yeah, I appreciate you gassing me up on the first episode. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. So you'll have your grades ready. So be ready for that post-draft as well. I want to thank you guys for joining us, and we'll catch up with you guys next time.
See you, fellas.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. That was a fun time.
Yeah.